Hello and welcome, book lovers, to your library at home and to tonight's edition of the B List, our monthly book club curated by the fabulous Bri Lee. I'm Sam Hagan from the library's public programming team, and even though we're all standing in different places this evening, I feel it's important to take this moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of this wide land and pay my respects to all elders past, present, and of course, emerging. In a minute, I'll be joined by Bri, but before that, I'd like to take a quick moment to alert you to an exciting new online diary project that we would really love your help with, the library. The project will launch tomorrow, so when you find yourself at a loose end over the next few days, please just jump online, go to www.sl.nsw.gov.au, where you'll be able to join in. But now to our main event. I'd like to ask Bri to join me. Bri, are you there?
Hello, I am. Can you hear me?
Hello, so nice to see you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm very excited.
Look at your bookshelves, all beautifully color-coded.
Yes. Well, this is the new sort of presentational home office. So yes, welcome to my lounge room.
Well, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I'll see you guys at the end of the show. Yes,
for the Q&A section. Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. To my mind, this is the first real B-List book club. Thank you to everyone who tuned in last month to just have a bit of a recap about what I was reading. But I'm so thrilled to be able to do a B-List club for reals with an author. And of course, we are all going to be hearing Donna Ward speak about her incredible book, I Dare Not Name. I'm just going to read Donna's bio and then ask her to join us. But I just want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A function in the Zoom program, and you can type questions into that as I'm speaking, as they come up. And Sam, who you just heard, will be monitoring that Q&A function throughout the chat. She'll be able to see if people have similar questions about overall themes, and Sam will be sort of funneling the questions to Donna at the end of this. So please type away as you think of something, or of course you can wait till the end and type your questions in there. Donna Ward is a publisher at Inkerman Blunt. She founded Indigo, the Journal of Western Australian Writing. Her prose can be found in journals and anthologies nationally, internationally, and online. She has past lives as a psychotherapist and as a social worker in welfare management and social policy development. She, I Dare Not Name, A Spinster's Meditations on Life, is Donna's first book. Donna, would you please join us? And normally what would happen now is that everyone in the room would give a round of applause, and I invite you at home to do the same. Good evening, Donna. Thank you so much for joining us for the first proper B-List book club.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Bri. I was very disappointed when I thought that we weren't going to do this, but we've overcome the plague of the 21st century.
Absolutely. There are three things in particular I just want to say up front that I loved most about your book. The first is the absolute honesty, sometimes to the point of almost gasp-inducing and real, to the core of the bone-hitting honesty. The second is just so many beautiful, beautiful sentences and paragraphs and passages. When I was reading this, I thought to myself, it absolutely showed that it was written by an author who very much works and lives in and around books and is an avid reader, because it was just so beautifully free of cliche and so beautifully written. And also, the final thing, which I feel really strongly about with nonfiction in particular, is that I think as often when I read books, I find the strong ones are often written by authors who, as readers, wanted to find a book and couldn't find it, and so felt they had to write it into existence. And I absolutely feel that that is the case with I Dare Not Name. Thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for reading it.
Oh, my pleasure. So I want to start there with this idea of there being a gap in the literature with my questions for you this evening. And I note on page 188, so quite a way in, you mentioned that the majority of literature sort of fails to capture the reality of your experience. And that there's this here, the majority of 20th century theories on psychological development identify marriage or coupling and parenting as proof of a person's psychological maturity. Hence the vast literature on forming and maintaining lifelong loving relationships and good enough parenting. And can you talk to us, I hope, a little bit about, to sort of set us off, why there is still these gaps and silences and these sort of this flawed, both in the sort of research as in academia, but also in the sort of literature?
Yes, it still amazes me, particularly when, I'll start with the research anyhow, particularly when reading the research on even books that are devoted to research on single life, but even just books that are to do with any kind of sociological slice of life. We don't separate out people who have never coupled or had children in particular. And it's such a different lifestyle to everyone who is either coupled and had children or perhaps not had children. Once there are children in the deal, the life is very different, and I'm sure everyone can automatically know that that would be the case. So I was very surprised that people who were researching this area hadn't thought about the fact that the groups that they were often comparing and contrasting was one homogeneous group, or one group that looked very similar. They were family, they might be divorced, but they had children. And then another group that had never had children. Now, they might have coupled, but they never had children. And that just seemed to have been missed completely, and I would have thought that stood out like a sore thumb. But it didn't, and I think it still doesn't, and let's hope that this conversation changes that to some extent. The other thing that I noticed too was that the literature that did look at spinsters in particular was a feminist literature, which had an agenda. And the agenda was to prove that life without a man, life that wasn't marriage, was an okay kind of life. And that life that you had to be spectacular, because you had all this time on your hands. If you weren't having a family, you had all this time on your hands to live a spectacular life, to do grand things. Now, I just never thought I was particularly capable of doing grand things. I mean, people laugh at me when I say that because they think I've done grand things, but and now that I've written a book, I know I've done grand things, but in a way, I don't feel like I'm a famous woman who's changed the world by any stretch of the imagination. And yet I felt, as I was reading these things, that there was an expectation on me since I was a spinster to be a Florence Nightingale or a suffragette or the equivalent of that for the 21st century. So I felt the agenda hadn't been looked at. So quite often, the books that are on the subject are really unconsciously unaware of this unconscious bias. And I think that they're unaware of it because in the 60s and 70s in particular, we decided that the word spinster was so taboo that we weren't going to use that anymore. And if we didn't, what we did, this happened across the world, we said spinster's not a word anymore. We're going to call everyone who doesn't marry single. And in America, that gets very confusing because they look at marriage as a particularly official position. And in their data collection, it's they're noticing people, they're picking up people in the marriage category who have married in the church or in a registry office, and that's only just been kind of in the last decade or so. But then in the never married or the single category, it's everyone that isn't. Sometimes can include even nuns. I just can't even get my head around that. So,
aren't they typically married to God? Isn't that how that works?
Yeah, well, they have to be in the married category and not the single one then. You know, it's just, Yeah, so it's a very unexamined thing. And so, and as I say in the book, and you'll know that I was trying very hard to find the person who would tell me that I've missed a whole lot of research, that there's this other literature that examines this in a very thought through way. But the thing was that I couldn't find anyone to tell me that, and I haven't yet found the books that really, really do look at it. And that was when I became aware. I had a colleague in the writing group that I was in who said, and she reminded me of things I'd learnt when I was a social worker. She said, when a group is disappeared like this, then it's prejudice. And it's an unthought, irrational bias against even considering that life is around and has existed. And I just think that that's what we're dealing with here, a very unconsidered prejudice. I'll tell you a little story that happened to me yesterday, if I could. My old school sent me, it was the old girls' school club, which I hate. I just hate that whole thing. So I saw the email and they were wanting to update the data. And the first question was to put your name down, which I did. And then I was asked to put my maiden name down. And I thought, well, I already have actually. And there would be lots of women, I thought, who may have coupled and still have their original name. So I was feeling fired up, so I wrote to them and said, this is a problem.
Yes.
In the most elegant language as I could. And then I said, it seems to me a bit old-fashioned to be asking for a maiden name, but maybe you want to say, have you had another name at any part of your life so that we can track you? And then at the bottom, they had occupation. And I said, look, I feel like I now have to fill in occupation, because if I tell you that I'm a spinster, then you'll be wanting to know what I've done with my life. And this is what I've done. And I said, I'm particularly alive to this issue because I've just published a book and I'm talking about it all the time. So they rang me back the next day and said, well, hello, Donna. We are getting together a magazine where we want to talk about inclusivity. And the one thing that we hadn't even thought of, even though both of us are spinsters, we hadn't thought to include spinsters in this discussion. We were all gobsmacked. That's how subtle it is and how internalized it is. We just assume. Yeah.
Someone pointed out to me recently how hilarious and absurd it is that we still use "what was your mother's maiden name" as a security question for and login purposes.
I know. It's great.
Which is like, the whole, Anyway, I was really interested in, I found interesting in your book how you talked about how these prejudices are historical. Could you tell us briefly about how these terms of spinster, but also crone, developed, and also, I was really interested to hear how you spoke about that association between bachelors and being sort of degenerates, like these terms and these ideas that we have inherited over time without properly interrogating.
Yeah, so they're just words. I have to say, I was saying to someone yesterday who didn't want to say the word spinster, who was saying, I'm still having trouble getting my mouth around that word. And I said, it's one word of like 8 letters. What's the problem here? And when you think of it, it's just one word with 8 letters. And in fact, when it was coined, it wasn't even to refer to women who weren't married. It was the professional name of women who spun. In the same way as lace maker was the medieval professional name of women who made, or people who made lace, and there were the silk weavers as well, and they were women as well. They didn't choose that term. It wasn't until the mid-1600s. So I think it's the book's right. What I'm going to say is probably wrong, but I think it was around about the 1300s that the term came into English usage. And then around the 1500s, we have Elizabeth I coming into England, and there was a great admiration for spinsters. They were seen in particular as women who were desirable for a partner because they had a job and some money in their pocket. So they came, and they were intelligent, articulate, responsible women in society, and so they were seen as something of value. And that remained until just after Elizabeth died, and she died in 1606. And so it was around the middle of the 1600s where we see the first dictionary coming out with the idea or the definition of the word spinster being changed to a woman who has remained unmarried past a certain age. And the word for a man like that is bachelor. So these days we think spinster is an unutterable word. But in those days it was still quite fine until these spinsters became old and dependent on sisters, husbands or brothers to keep them, and they were ill and all the rest of things that age brings, and so that was the beginning of them becoming undesirable. And that word has just remained undesirable. It's collected more and more ugly terms with it than bachelor. Bachelor in those days wasn't a particularly desirable word either, and in fact in the colonies of America, they instituted a bachelor tax. I don't have this in the book, but it is something that you can read about, this bachelor tax. And it was to encourage men to get married because they didn't want to get married. There's a surprise.
Oh, wow.
And we in Australia, our Australian men, particularly in the colony, it seems that they weren't particularly interested in marrying, and that I think it was Governor Phillip was getting very upset that the men wouldn't marry, and tried to force everyone into that. But in the colony, it was the Scottish and Irish were mainly the convicts, and when they became free men, they didn't feel that they were under British law because they were Irish and Scottish, and they didn't care. So they didn't get married. They were hooked up with women. But also the other part of the colony is that there was something like 8 men for every woman. So, there was a bit of a bias there in terms of the gender differentiation. That changed mid-last century here in Australia, and that's when you discover that not only is the balance changing in the 60s and 70s between men and women in Australia, it's kind of even, and then it's now it's more women than men. But at that time, men were much more interested. It was the 60s and 70s, so they were much more interested in having a good time and not being responsible and settling down. Women, on the other hand, were being, mobilised into equality and women's liberation was quite strong then. It was the second wave. This is the era I was growing up in, and so I was looking for a partner that would be my equal, as many women were, and there weren't many, and those men usually with my friends. But that's the fate of it. But
if you don't mind, this is exactly what I wanted to talk about next, was because the chapter called Australia Goddamn was absolutely one of my favorites. And I was really hoping you could talk to us about, it's just so interesting for me to read about how the works of, in particular, Germaine Greer and Anne Summers, respectively with The Female Eunuch and Damned Horse and God's Police.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about those ideas, obviously specifically how they relate to sort of marriage or versus singledom, and just how much they sort of rocked both Australian society at that time and how formative that was for you growing up?
Yeah. It was an incredible moment. Not that I had really thought, I didn't sit back and think, as I was in primary school and high school, I didn't think, oh goodness, I'm going to grow up and have a family. I didn't have that idea in my mind. I just assumed it would happen. I don't even think, that's even saying it to it's putting words to something that I didn't really have words for. It was just, I was growing up, you went to school, you went to university, you got a career. At some time, you would get married and have children, or couple, because it was already that, you could be de facto. And that was what Germaine Greer in particular brought, this idea that you didn't have to marry if you didn't want to. That was very clear. She was, we claim her as an Australian, and she really does claim Australia as her country, but the book was written in England and it was very much set in the English system. So the only thing that I was at odds with was her fight against the patriarchy was the British patriarchy, and the British class system was sort of subtly in the background there. But for me, when I started to think about what she had written and apply that to my life, I was noticing that Australia was a bit different. Australia already had Anne Summers. Anne Summers had written Damned Whores and God's Below, or hadn't, she was a little bit later, but when I was coming to those books, that conversation, the movement towards having a Whitlam government, and then with a little brief moment of Malcolm Fraser, and then we had Keating and Hawke, and those eras was just a solid progress into how we can have a society where if a woman doesn't want to marry, can she have a good income? Can she look after her children? Can she have a house over her head? Can she keep herself safe? All those things that Anne Summers was saying, look, at the moment, a woman's, got a snowflake's chance in hell of having a good financial foundation to her life and protecting her child. And really, it's just on the luck of whether or not she meets a good man. And as I've just said, in Australia, exactly at that point, men were becoming very relaxed, shall we say, about their desire to marry and to partner. Free sex, the pill, all of that just opened up everybody's opportunity to have sex whenever and wherever. The only thing I was, slightly worried about might have been herpes or gonorrhea. We hadn't had AIDS. It was a completely different world to the one we face today. And certainly now with COVID, we don't even shake hands. Whereas in those days, we could do just about everything. So we could have free love. In fact, it was important to do so. It was part of your growing up. And we had these women who were saying, in fact, you must know who you are before you decide who you're going to settle down with and whether that person's going to help you have the kids. And then in Australia, very different to America and England, where we just had these men who were larrikins. And,
And in talking about the opposite to that, you use this term wisteria lane. Can you just tell us what you mean by that? And then I've just got here that you wrote that by 2015, Whitlam's grand tapestry had unraveled. Talk to us about those things.
So Whitlam, in the essay, I do this wonderful paragraph written by Anne Summers that just really articulates how difficult it is for a woman to be safe and get ahead and live in Australia. And what Whitlam did when he came in was he started to tick off all her lists. So Family Law Court came in, equal pay for women was almost there, like he made great changes there. It was funding for childcare and all of these things that we want as women just to get through our lives. He put in place, and then when Hawke came in, Malcolm Fraser didn't unravel them. When Hawke and Keating came in, they did even more. And in fact, they asked Anne Summers to head up the Office for Women's Affairs. And so then we had John Howard, and really, I mean, Tony Abbott was there. He was a young man, but you could see that these attitudes were now starting to change. They didn't think that these things should be funded. And so John Howard was probably the most destructive of women's lives. He just literally undid everything that the Whitlam Hawke Keating governments put in, right down to in particular unfunding women's refuges. And when Tony Abbott came into power, it was like the death knell. He just cut all funding to women's refuges, and that was sort of the last thing that had to be done. And he was really saying quite openly that, as far as he was concerned, women should get married and have children rather than postpone having children until later. He thought they should have it when their bodies are young and nubile. So they had a very clear idea of the comfortable Australia that John Howard wanted to establish. But in my view, that's a very conservative wisteria lane. Look, I'm just, I mean, there's a little bit of a riff on Desperate Housewives going on there for me. I just don't know whether I thought that through. But to me, it was an image of that very, very conservative society that Howard was really interested in bringing in. And Tony Abbott and this conservative government under which we've been living for far too long now, in my view, would like that to happen as well. I just, if I may say, you know, I feel it's been interesting watching the stimulus responses of the government and the way they've responded to COVID. I can see how clearly they have no idea of the diversity and the variety of family life and lives in general in Australia. You can see that they have a very clear idea of a nuclear family. It's very conservative, nuclear family. The bloke goes out to work, the mum looks after the kids. You know, what's homeschooling? What's the problem? Why aren't you doing it? You know, let's pay the private schools to get them back doing what they should be doing. So I know. But we fought back because we're Victorians. So, yeah. Does that answer? I feel like I've rambled a bit there. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I just wanted to hear about, I guess that exciting time.
The
Angry and their Ann Summers, and the real, you know, these were not just people who were, although it is very important, of course, writing books and opining, you know, the fact that Ann Summers was then appointed to a role that had real policy outcomes, and there were a couple of good back-to-back governments who made colossal changes that actually fundamentally improved equality in the country, and then how that has just sort of but I don't want to talk about Tony Abbott anymore.
No,
because I'm having a nice time. I would love for you to do a reading for us now that we spoke about. And I would like for this reading, I suppose, to take us into a bit more of a conversation about your life in particular, obviously, because this is a memoir. So when you're ready, please.
Good. Okay, so this is out of an essay that's called And There Was Kissing, and it's really about the blokes that I was encountering, mainly in the 70s and 80s, and how disappointing they were, really.
It does come through, sorry, I must say.
I really enjoyed writing this essay. At 36, I was still in the schoolyard playing musical chairs with increasingly disappointing men. My best and closest friends were partnered with children or dancing with the person they would settle with in the end. They were kind and fitted our friendship around the edges of their lives, but we had less and less in common. They had children, renovations, debt, fundraising trivia nights for school, ageing parents and errant husbands, matters for grown-ups. I felt their diminishing patience, sometimes contempt for my incompetence. After all, hooking up was basic. Anyone could do it if they wanted, and everyone was doing it. Even people who didn't want to were doing it. and between their words and glances, I knew they believed I was actively choosing a different path, some feminist career with no time for the mundanity of family, as if no feminist ever inadvertently tumbled into love and formed a family. In truth, I was in a crisis for which the answers were impossibly mythological. Icarus-like, I plunged toward a fate that looked for all the world like a concrete garden. When I lost my job, I took a year off to make sense of my life. I'm not sure I did.
Thank you. So in that passage, you speak about being 36. You open the book with a passage from when you were 38, and those you describe these types of Sunday gatherings that you so valued and sounded so wonderful with your friends that wouldn't be happening for much longer because people's lives were taking that different track. Elsewhere, I noted that at 32, you mentioned that was when you really started worrying about not sort of trundling along that sort of well-trodden expected path. I was wondering if maybe you could talk to us about a couple of, or however many, key stages or sort of pivotal moments when this anxiety or concern of a divergence with your group started happening.
Well, I guess that opening scene in the book was a big moment. It was just when I think, you know, the scene in that moment is in a cafe down the road from where I live, and we used to meet on Sundays. And I don't know that we ever really formalised it. We just kind of chaotically met on Sundays. But I remember that particular one, and I think it had been growing for me, but that particular one, absolutely everyone in the group was saying, oh, I can't come next week or for the next 2 weeks because we're going away with the family for some reason. And it was that moment where I thought, oh, the world's really changed, and all the time that I thought was, I just assumed that into the rest of my life, weekends, I would have a group to catch up with. That on holidays, I might go away with people. But this was the first time no one had asked me to come with them because they were either going with their lovers or their family or whatever else they were doing on the weekends, but mainly it was those two things. And I was really beginning to understand that this concept of family time was around that time. And I thought, oh, family time. So family time does not include me because I'm party time. And when you have, you're settled down in a relationship or and definitely when you're into family time, friendship is that thing that's on the edge of your life that you catch up with when you've got time. I knew that instinctively because I'd grown up in a family. I know how families work. So at that stage, that was when I felt plummeted into this space around the edge of family, which felt pretty black and cold and dark at that stage. Now I quite enjoy it, but that's another part of the book, really, another story in the book. But I'd say, yeah, look, there was that time. I remember particularly there was this guy that I was interested. He was married. He was interested in me. There was nothing really going on. And I decided at that point that I wasn't going to do any more complicated relationships because they never turned out in my favour, that was for sure. And so I was driving down St Kilda Road toward the city, and it just hit me. I thought, oh, this is the pattern. They're all going to be problematic. They're just all going to be problematic. So, you know, that was a blank after that. Yeah. So it's very, sorry.
Oh, there was this incredible sentence that really struck me where you wrote that at one point in time, I fear releasing myself from the hope of a peopled life. And that obviously that when you wrote that, you were afraid of what acknowledging or accepting that this was a real possibility or likelihood.
Yes, it was. And it was, I think in the book I tell another story where it was Friday afternoon, and I just finished I was a therapist at the time, and I just finished a day of sessions. And I realised that I hadn't actively planned my weekend. And that's the kind of transition you make, because you go from this time when your weekends are really, they make fun of themselves in a way. That didn't come out right, but you don't have to plan the weekend.
Mm.
And then, because your friends will, unexpectedly turn up or whatever the story is. But that Friday I thought, oh my God, I haven't planned the weekend. I'm fucked, basically. That's how it felt. And that was really a moment where I thought, oh, I'm going to have to face the reality of this life, because it doesn't seem to be going to be different for me. I'm going to have to accept, and in those days I didn't use the word spinster because of course it was taboo. I had to face that I was going to be single, and I was pretty close to 40 at that time. I think maybe 2 years away from it or something.
I'd like to ask you about solitude itself, because some of my favorite passages of the writing in the book were really reflecting on that, what that means to different people. Can you talk to us a bit about how I counted 3 other people that you either read about or went and spoken to, but who had chosen solitude for themselves? Can you speak a bit about how solitude is different for the people who choose it versus someone like yourself?
Well, we're all in a state at the moment where the solitude that we're dealing with is not chosen. And when it's not chosen, we think of particularly people who are forced into solitude, or people who might be in solitary confinement for some reason, or may have to go and hide in a cave for some reason. That people who don't choose solitude are frightened of it. They don't know how to behave, how to be in it. They have all the same experiences as someone who chooses solitude, only it's the reverse. So, for example, this time of solitude I've really looked forward to, because as I say in the book, I read Sarah Maitland wrote a beautiful book called A Book of Silence, where she talks about, really pulls out all the experiences of being in solitude. And one of the first things that happens is that you get very tired. Your body sort of feels this weightiness about it. You then move into a state where you find everything ecstatic. Food is delicious, and the world is wonderful. And then I'm just trying to think of all of the others, but you lose your boundaries. People are talking about this. You lose your boundaries. You can't remember what day it is, and you get a bit relaxed about your clothing. She calls it disinhibition, and these sorts of things happen. If your solitude's been forced on you, exactly the same range of things happen, only you react to them negatively. So the food might taste better, but you don't taste it because you don't want to be doing what you're doing. Your body feels heavy, and so you say you're depressed, you feel depressed, you sleep more, you feel depressed, your dreams are vivid, you hate them because you think that they're scary, or they are scary, because you're in a psychological state where you're frightened of the solitude. And I think we've been hearing a bit of this, this angst about solitude. The climbing of walls, and and the tiredness. I've heard people reporting vivid dreams. Certainly the tiredness, certainly the disinhibition, and those sorts of things that Sarah Maitland talks about. But people have not wanted to be in solitude, and so they are experiencing it negatively. If you actually, and I have to say, I was really happy. I'll just say that I'll put a little caveat on that. I prefer the life that I have without COVID, just saying. But I did think, I can do this. It's really just means I'm not going out to work in cafes. I like working in cafes and coming home. Gives me a kind of rhythm to my day. I thought there have been times when I've worked at home and lived at home, this will be fine. And it was. I was a bit worried. We didn't know in the beginning whether or not we were going to be locked in without enough food in the cupboard, you know, whether we could go out and buy food. So I went and stocked my cupboards. I was very deliberate about that, panicky but deliberate about getting everything that I needed in my cupboards and getting prepared for hunkering down in a solitary confinement kind of way. That actually hasn't happened, so lucky. But when, I think it was the second week or so, I got on everything prepared, and there had been an announcement about lockdown, I think. There was a big announcement made. It was Scott Morrison got out there and said something that might have been lockdown, the restrictions we're dealing with now. And I was happy with myself and ready to go. And then when the newscast was off, I just thought, oh, I really miss not having someone to share this experience with. I have not felt that in decades. It was overwhelming. I don't mean that I went to bed and wept or anything, but I was so stunned that I'd had that thought or that feeling, because it was such an unfamiliar feeling and a long ago feeling where I wanted someone, you know, when I go and watch a sunset and think, well, did I watch it because I didn't have a companion with me? And I've kind of worked that out in my head, but I was shocked about that. And then just recently, and I would say in the last couple of days, I've actually thought to myself, I'm seriously missing the accidental or incidental socialising that happens when I go and work in a cafe or go shopping or something like that. The conversations that occur. I've been very lucky. People have rung me. So many people have rung me and stayed in touch with me. And I don't have to plan my days like I used to have to plan my weekends. In fact, yesterday I just thought, oh, nobody's rung. And then somebody rang me. So I feel like I'm lucky now. I've got a life that's working. It's taken only 60 years. What can I say? Not 40 probably, but it takes a while. And I think that all lives take a while.
Well, my final question for you, and so for everyone at home, if you haven't already written a question that you want to ask Donna, now is the time to do it. My question for you, Donna, as someone who sort of has come to be quite an expert at the solitary life, do you have any advice for people who are struggling at the moment? Because we know they are.
Look, I think the struggle is genuine, and it's the very first moment of solitude. The very first thing that everyone faces in solitude is the absolute unmitigating, daunted quality. I'm just messing up my words. You wouldn't know I was a writer, actually. But there's just it's incredibly daunting to be alone 24/7 if that's what you have to be. My suggestion is just be curious about how this affects you. Be curious. Are you sleeping? Sleep if you have to. Be curious about the fact that that's what your body does in this. If you're dreaming, write your dreams down. If you find you can't be bothered putting clothes on, do not worry about that. Don't judge yourself in this. That, I think, is the most thing. Be absolutely and utterly curious about this experience. We're not going to get it again. Not in our lifetime. We're not going to get it. And remember that everybody else is struggling in it as well. That would be my main things.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sam, are you there? Can I invite you back? If you do not have sufficient questions from our viewers, I have plenty more that I would love to have asked Donna. So
hello, thank you so much, Donna. That was fascinating, so interesting. I do have some questions. Some people have been sending some through. There's been a couple of questions about how, Donna, how do you believe your engagement in social work and policy has shaped your writing of this book? one of the questions?
That's a great question.
It is. I don't think I've ever thought about that. Look, first of all, it's a very different kind of writing. When you're doing social policy and social policy and I've done some kind of reviews of things like Black Saturday Fires. I did a report on that. I think the big thing about writing, the big thing about any kind of writing is getting the beautiful idea that you want to get across down. And that was where certainly my policy writing has helped me, because usually when you're in the welfare sector writing anything, you're wanting to change someone's mind. You want them to change the world, and that's why you're writing. And I think that is the same with anything. If you're writing a book or an essay or anything, you've got to think of what's the beautiful idea that you're trying to get across. How is the person that's reading what you've written going to change because they've read what you have written? Yeah, I think that's it, the answer to that question.
Thanks, Donna. There is another one here which, having also read the book, I was interested in too, so it's a bit of a selfish one. Katrina is asking about mythology, and she's saying that it's an interesting theme through your book, and can you talk a little bit about why it's so strong in your writing? She says, was this always an interest of yours? Because she really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yes, mythology has been something that's intrigued me since I can't remember. I've always been fascinated with, and I'm going to sound a bit heretical, and I hope I don't offend anybody here, but I consider, although I have some faith in it myself, I consider Christianity a mythology as well. And that thought came to me quite young when I realised that there were so many different mythologies or religions around the world, and they have their stories. And as you consider their stories, you start to see the same themes happening. And then when I became psychotherapist, or probably before that, when I went into therapy, and my therapist was a Jungian-based therapist, and so suddenly I was in the world of the archetypes and how those archetypes connected with me, or I connected with them, and at that stage, my just all-consuming interest in mythology started to make sense, that I could apply this to my everyday life. And so I can't write without it. In fact, a lot of the social policy reports that I've written, and when I was an organisational consultant and I wanted to talk about the dynamics that was going down in a conflict situation or something, I would have to write the mythological version, like which myth it was reminding me of at the time, and make all the beginning connections of the points I wanted to make out of those stories. And then I wrote the next draft that didn't have the myth in it. So this time, my book, I can put myth in it.
So great. Here's an interesting one from Stacey, who is asking for some advice. She says she's a young woman who comes from a big family, 5 siblings, so obviously busy home, who doesn't feel she wants kids, but wants to pursue a life that's, in her words, just as worthy. Can you have any advice for her?
Well, first of all lives are as worthy as the other. Don't let yourself ever think that your marital status gives you an entitlement or takes an entitlement away from you. It doesn't. We have, according to the philosophers, 70 years and 10 on the planet. That's 70 years. These days we're getting up to 90 years. It's still not very much time. Don't waste it judging yourself or letting others judge you for social constructs about whether you have children or whether or not. Just own the life that you want to live, and be authoritative. Just don't let people off the hook. That's what I would say.
That's
And good luck
great.
with that, because I realise that's a really hard thing to do.
This will have to be our last question. We've got a few, and Donna, if it's okay, I'll try and send these through to you, so you might be able to spend some time thinking about them and maybe even answering a couple. But
Sure.
for the last question, firstly from Amanda, who says, great interview. Thank you, Bri, again, and Donna. Donna, do you think you might ever take the subject matter of this book into the realm of fiction or head in that direction with this subject?
I consider myself an utter failure at fiction. I've written one short story, and it's been published, and it was so based on real life that you know, I had to get permission from the person. So I just I don't even read fiction, to be honest. I do when, you know, there's very occasional fiction that will call me, but I'm so interested in real life. It's so fascinating to me how it works and how it doesn't work that I can't see that I would ever be drawn to fictionalise it. However, if there's a fiction writer out there who wants to do it on my behalf, that would be fine.
There's a job for someone.
Yes.
Great. So Bri, I'm going to hand back over to you to make your announcement. Thank you, Donna. That was brilliant.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us, Donna. I absolutely loved this book. I hope that everyone who hasn't already read it is thoroughly convinced by hearing you speak this evening. Thank you so much. And just for all of the audience, special announcement, of course, at the end of each book club, we announce what book is next. And the next guest that will be joining me is Tyson to talk about Sand Talk, which came out, I think, last year by Text Publishing. So if you can, please join us in May. I'm pretty sure we have the date and we'll be able to put the URL up this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bri, and thanks again, Donna. So before we go, we'll let you know that you will be able to register for the next B list from tomorrow. We've just got to get that up online. So from tomorrow, jump online, register. And I've just got one more little announcement with some library business. We have got an event coming up on Thursday the 14th with the library's very own crime writing expert, Rachel Franks, who will be talking about crime writing. So if you're a fan of that genre, jump online. You can register for that event as well. But that's a wrap for us for tonight. Thank you so much to Bri and Donna. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you everybody for joining us. I hope that you're getting used to our new online events. We are getting used to them, but it doesn't make up for seeing you all in person. So as always, keep safe, stay warm, it's getting chilly, and hopefully we'll see you back in the library on some sunny day. Take care. Bye.